What ultimately has my attention? What has my attention? It's been said that attention is one of the greatest assets. And we live in a world that is constantly vying for our attention. Social media, AI and the algorithms, and dare I say this, don't get too mad at me, please, cable news. So many things trying to get us to focus here or there. And yet, Paul says the way that we experience the peace of God is we focus on that relationship that we have with God. We live in that relationship today. We choose to operate in that relationship not by dwelling on where we've been or thinking too far into the future about where we will be, but we live today in that relationship with God. We trust in God's presence. We trust in God's goodness. We seek him out. We find joy in the present as we live fully aware of God's presence and the relationship that we have with him today. You know, I'm a big sports fan. I love sports. This past week, I watched way too many football games. I did a lot, and some of us did that, right? That was like the holiday. I was watching a lot of sports. I especially love basketball, big fan of basketball. So right now, I love it because college basketball is happening, the NBA is back. And so I watch a lot of games. And within sports, there's this argument, and really it's in all sports, but it happens a lot in basketball. And the argument, who is the greatest of all time? Call it the GOAT, right? Who's the greatest of all time? And there's lots of different opinions about that. Who's the best player to ever play? And people will argue, and they'll show stats and all this. But most people think that the greatest player to ever play basketball was Michael Jordan, right? He's the greatest of all time. Oh, we got some applause there. All right, I love it. That he's the greatest of all time. And you know, when you look at Michael Jordan, just how he was, I mean, he was dominant. He could score. He could play defense. He did all these different things. Well, there was this great documentary that came out a couple years ago about Michael Jordan and the 90s Bulls and their championship run. It's called The Last Dance. It's an amazing documentary. Even if you hate basketball, it's a great documentary. I encourage you should check it out. And what happens in this documentary is they go behind the scenes and they look at, you know, the games and the different players, and they do these interviews, and Michael Jordan will talk about things, and it's really funny because he's very opinionated, you know, and people just have all these different ideas and thoughts about how things are. But what I found so interesting, though, was that people were describing why Michael Jordan was so great. And people would say things like, well, he just was really athletic. He was able to do things that no one else could do. Or they say he had this incredible work ethic, like he was in the gym before anyone else, and he was the last person to leave, and he just was always working on his game. Or they say he had this killer mindset, and just whenever the game was on the line, he was going to will that team to victory. He was just going to lead the charge. He was going to do it. But there was this comment that was made about him that I thought was fascinating. And someone said that the reason why he was so successful, the reason why he was so great, was because he had the ability to be fully present and engaged in the moment. Out of all the stuff that was going on, he had this ability to just be present. We call that in sports being clutch, right? When the game is on the line, when the time is ticking down, the clock's ticking down, can you perform? And he did that because of his ability to be present. You know, what's interesting is Paul gives us this advice for living in connection with God. Paul isn't saying that just out of theory. Paul's describing his experience in his life. Paul knew what it was like to go through tough times, pressure-filled situations. I mean, he was in prison multiple times. He was beat up. He was shipwrecked. I mean, he knew what it was like to have a lot. He knew what it was like to have nothing. And yet what he will say again and again is that it was that relationship with God based on the fact that God was with him that led to peace, that led to him to be able to say, I can rejoice in God even in difficult circumstances and situations because God's present. And I am living my life here and now connected to God in that relationship.